Welcome to Fireside Chats with Erin. I'm Erin Gowriluk, the President of the Canada Grains Council and your host. This podcast serves as a platform to explore grain sector priorities that reflect the Council's work here at home and around the world. Together, we will discuss issues and ideas with policymakers and industry influencers. And this month, we're hosting a series of conversations with our American colleagues so that together we can explore areas of common interest, including trade and innovation, among other things. Because regardless of what our political leaders say and do, we are very often aligned with our industry partners south of the border, and there has never been a better time to leverage those relationships. And joining me today is Jim Sutter, the CEO of the U.S. Soybean Export Council. With a rich commercial background in the food and agriculture sector, following leadership roles in Cargill's global grains and oilseeds business, Jim plays a key role in defining and driving USEC's vision for U.S. soy as a trusted, sustainable source of nutrition and energy worldwide. Jim leads a global team focusing on differentiating, elevating preference, and enabling market access to U.S. soy for human consumption, aquaculture, and livestock feed in 80-plus countries internationally. In addition, he actively collaborates with USEC's 100-plus members who represent the soy value chain, including U.S. soy farmers, processors, commodity shippers, merchandisers, and food and agriculture organizations. Jim is a global citizen, having built and led teams in Europe, Southeast Asia, and the United States. He was raised on his family's crop and cattle farm in Colorado. He is a glass half full optimist, a half marathoner, and has a passion for a brighter future for all. Sounds like a good guy to talk to this week. Jim, thank you for stopping by for a fireside chat.
Thank you for the invitation. I really look forward to this. And I know when we agreed to do this a while ago, little did we know all the things we'd have to talk about today. So
you may have to correct me along the way. I wrote my script a few hours ago. I'm not sure if anything has changed since then. I've revised it several times. So let's do the very best we can to work with the information
let's do all we
that
can.
we have
if
at our
news
disposal.
flashes come through, we may have to update the comments.
Okay. I'm digging in. This week, the United States imposed tariffs on all Canadian goods exported to the United States at a rate of 25%, 10% for energy products. Now, I recognize that tariffs have since been paused. Some tariffs have since been paused again. What impact will a tariff have on Canadian goods when it's exported to the American ag industry?
Yeah, so clearly we've seen a lot of activity with regard to tariffs in the last few days, as you mentioned. What I'm hearing from people, I think there's just a little bit of people were maybe not so surprised that tariffs are coming. I think we've heard that from this administration since they were on the campaign trail. They talked about tariffs and how they were going to use them. Mm-hmm. I think that some of us had been hoping that perhaps it may be delayed a little further and there would be more of a discussion about them. But anyway, this is the way things go. And in terms of your question, how will it impact goods coming from Canada to the U.S.? What I hear from farmers is they're very concerned about the fertilizer that they bring into the United States. And so that is certainly an issue that they are worried about and thinking about because, for forever since I've known U.S. agriculture, we've had this open relationship with Canada and it's, things have just kind of flowed back and forth. So we've never had a consideration really that one country stops and another starts. It's been more of just an integrated marketplace. The other thing that I'm hearing people talk about is, of course, the canola situation. And by that, I mean canola oil and canola meal produced in Canada comes to the United States and is used in a variety of applications, whether feeding dairy cattle or fueling, helping to cook French fries or fueling biodiesel plants. So, there is this integrated chain back and forth between the countries. So honestly, I have asked a couple of our members, and we've got a wide range of companies, but big companies that are involved in the importation of some of those canola products. And I've said, how do you deal with a 25% tariff going into place overnight? And they just look at me and sort of say, we're trying to figure it out. So, Erin, I know that's not a very good answer, but it's concerning. It's worrying for the companies that are involved in it. And I think everybody, and you mentioned the sort of pausing of some of the tariffs. And honestly, I'm not sure if the canola, if there's still a tariff on canola oil today with the pausing or not. But I think our industry is sort of assuming that this will get figured out, both the fertilizer situation and the flowing of goods going back and forth. But we'll have to see.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like uncertainty on both sides of the border, looking for greater clarity, certainly going into next week.
Right.
How important is the Canadian market for U.S. soybeans?
Well, the Canadian market is the number 8 market for our U.S. soy exports. Exports in general are really important to the U.S. soy industry. We export roughly 60% of the soybeans that are produced in the United States are exported as beans, meal, or oil. So they're really primary products of soy. If you add in the soy that's exported in the form of meat, so poultry meat or pork meat that would get exported, it gets up to 65% of the U.S. crop that gets exported. So soy, probably more than most commodities grown in the United States, is really dependent, I would say, or really focused on international markets. So all of this talk of tariffs and what's going to happen really are important to us. But your question, Canada is important, especially as the United States has been ramping up the crush of soybeans in the U.S. Soybean meal is the main product that we ship to Canada. And I think we view that it's a very important feed ingredient for people that are producing livestock in Canada, primarily pigs, I think, but also some poultry. But so we have, again, this kind of long-term relationship that I spoke about before, that I think we haven't imagined that there's a border there that has much impact with trade. So hopefully we'll get back to that. This administration and I think they've talked about tariffs for a long time. So we look at them as hopefully they'll do whatever they need to do and they'll get their negotiations out of the way. And the tariffs that are in place will hopefully be short-lived, and we'll be able to get back to a more open and predictable trading pattern.
My next question for you is one that I've explored as part of this podcast series with our American colleagues. And then more recently here in Edmonton this week for our annual Canadian Crops Convention, we had a handful of American colleagues joining us here. How can we work together, Jim, Canadian and American colleagues? We are like-minded associations. How do we collectively advocate for the permanent removal of these tariffs and a return to really a more predictable and stable policy environment that's going to facilitate the free flow of goods between, to your point, these two very highly integrated, highly interdependent markets?
Sure. Well, Erin, I think that's a really good question. And I think it's something that we need to think about. How do we communicate that most effectively? And I think we really are like-minded. And I think there's no doubt when you hear about some of the objectives of the administration to have fair and free trade with all of the counterparties with which the United States trades, and I'm sure Canada feels the same way, I think it's very hard to argue with that. So I think we need to reiterate that is a good goal. I don't think it does any good to tell the administration that that's a bad goal, because I think it's a very logical goal. We should want that. I think our job is to help educate. How do we best do that? I know we are looking at the comments about reciprocal tariffs that the U.S. administration has made. And they're now looking at several different countries and having, how should we have a reciprocal trading relationship or reciprocal tariffs? We've understood this to mean more of looking at the trading relationship, because purely looking at tariffs on items, the U.S. doesn't import all the items it exports to other countries. So you can't just look to make sure the tariffs are exactly the same. I think it's a much more broad look. And we're kind of embracing that and saying, wow, this is good, because it could be like free trade agreement discussions with numerous countries. And for years, we've been saying, let's have more free to trade agreements between the United States and other counterparts. And I would guess that the Canadians, you feel the same way. So I think to be maybe embracing this idea of free and fair trade with counterparties around the world, whether they're trading with the US or whether they're trading with Canada, I think those are really good messages for us to have. And I think the other part of it is, you talked about predictable and, having something that we can plan on and that our industries can plan on. I think, continuing to look at USMCA, making sure that, as far as I know, I think the USMCA has generally been something that has been working for the countries. I understand, I hear some talk about specific commodities that are maybe more problematic than others. I would encourage that we need to tell our fellow associations and fellow people, hey, if there are problem areas, try and get those worked out so we don't blow up the whole agreement because of a couple small problem areas. That would be my own opinion. I don't know if that's really how the trade negotiators look at it, but I'm always in favor of trying to remove the problems, because I think when generally things are working smoothly, then kind of inertia or just the consistency will keep them going in that way. So I think it's to have a message that we want free and fair trade with all of the people both our countries trade with. Both of us are big agriculture exporters. We don't have as many people in our countries as we can produce agricultural crops. So we supply the world. So advocating on behalf of free and open trade is important. And then making sure that the trade that's happening between our two countries is working as it was intended in USMCA.
Excellent advice. I don't disagree on either one of those points. So again, very much aligned. Jim, this is my last question on the topic of tariffs, and I want to shift for a moment away from North America. And I'm going to appreciate, if you can maybe bring me up to speed if the information that I have here at the ready is not entirely accurate. But I'd like to better appreciate the impact that U.S. tariffs aimed at China are going to have on your members. So at this point, my understanding is that all imports from China into the United States are now facing a 20% tariff, up from 10% in February. China has since retaliated now with a 10% tariff on U.S. soybeans. This is your number one market, is it not? How has U.S. USEC responded?
Yeah, so Erin, so all that is exactly how I understand it at this point in time. So I don't think there's any change to that right now. So indeed, China is the biggest export market for U.S. soy. I mentioned Canada's number 8. China's number 1, Mexico's number 2, the EU's sometimes number 2. Mexico and EU kind of go back and forth, but China's big. And China is the biggest import market for soy overall in the world. They've really grown to be a big importer, taking almost 60% of global trade ends up in China. So I say that just because, some people say, well, just don't sell your soy to China, sell it somewhere else, and it'll all balance out. China is so big that we cannot do without China as a market. We need to participate in China if we want the U.S. soy industry to continue to be a leader in exporting to the rest of the world. So we're disappointed that we would see this tariff be put on, but again, maybe not so surprised. I think with the tariffs, the retaliation is probably to be expected. I guess our comments would be this, first off, we've had a long-term relationship in China. Our organization and predecessor organization started working on behalf of U.S. farmers and the Foreign Agricultural Service in China in 1982. So what is that, 43 years ago? And so we have had long-term relationships with companies, with associations, groups in China. And I believe they appreciate the work that the U.S. soy industry has done. And they value that. So we have that long-term relationship going for us. They want to continue sourcing soy from the United States. The discussion about what should the relationship be like between the U.S. and China? We think there's an excellent example there. The Phase 1 agreement that was negotiated after the 1819 sort of trade war. It was signed on January 15th, 2020. Between the United States and China. Both President Trump and President Xi said, wow, this is a great agreement. It's going to do great things. And it started to do great things. And there were a lot of there was a trade component of certain volume of purchases, But there were also lots of other regulatory issues that were going to be smoothed out. And much of that happened. But if you think back to Jan 15, 2020, shortly after that, COVID hit. And that sort of interrupted the pattern that many things were going on. And then shortly after that, we had a new administration, another year later. And so the phase one agreement never really got all the traction or all the opportunity to perform that it had. So what I've been suggesting to anybody that would listen, whether government or others, hey, there was this phase one agreement. So now we have a little, friction between ourselves. Let's go grab that phase one agreement. Look at all the good things that were negotiated. Let's don't say we have to have a whole new negotiation. Let's focus on kind of picking that up, making a phase two or a new and improved phase one, whatever you want to call it, but using that as the basis for how we can continue our trading relationship. And I've been pleased to hear, not that the suggestion came from me. I'm sure many other smart people thought of that. But I've heard many people within U.S. places talking about that as a possible place to pick up these negotiations. So the Chinese tariffs, very important. If anything, one last point I would make on this is sort of the time of year that I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but normally our shipments to China go down at this time of year because the South American crop's being harvested and we kind of are seasonal suppliers. So if we don't ship that much to China in the next few months, we probably wouldn't have anyway. But we sure hope we can use this time to get the leaders together and find a way forward. So by the time we harvest our crop in the fall, we'll have open doors and be able to be trading with China again.
It sounds to me like we have two agreements. You have two agreements, the U.S. does, with China in your phase one deal, with the USMCA or CUSMA, both delivered under Trump's first administration. It would really be helpful if there was some consensus, if you will, to go back and revisit the agreements that he himself signed off on. To your point, look for opportunities to do better, but use those agreements as a foundational piece for trade between the two countries going forward.
Very well said, Erin. That's probably a lot more concise way of saying that than I said it. So
let's hope that's where we end up. At this point, we welcome the review, the renegotiation, whatever it is you want to call it, that was scheduled for the summer, I think, of 2026. If that has to happen now, we'd be in a much better place than where we are currently. So let's hope that's where we're headed. We're going to leave the topic of tariffs, unless, of course, this was a topic of conversation for you when you were in Denver earlier this week at the annual U.S. Commodity Classic Trade Show and Conference. I know one of our members just joined our board meeting here in Edmonton last week after Crosby Devitt. He's the CEO of Grain Farmers of Ontario, spent some time with you folks down there. I'm assuming you were there. Our annual convention took place this week, and I can tell you, I'm sure you can guess what the topic of conversation was here in Canada amongst delegates. What were folks talking about in Denver this week? What was the overall mood?
Well, I would say, I'm always pleased, and I grew up, in a farming community. So I have farming in my background and in my blood. And one thing that kind of despite how difficult times become, farmers have some optimism. And I love that about working with farmers because, some people become doom and gloom and, the end of the world is just in sight. Not farmers. They are always optimistic, but I think also realistic. And there was some, on the realistic side, they're concerned about prices, both commodity prices that are low, and I heard them talking about input prices that are high. Earlier, we spoke about the possible impact of a tariff on goods coming in from Canada, what that could mean for fertilizer prices. I think that's of concern. So there's just concern because the economics in their farming industry are challenged right now. And well, they're optimistic, and they have to be in order to plant a crop every year and then count on Mother Nature and many other things to allow it to grow. There's just some worry. And then they're looking at us, U.S. Soybean Export Council, and many other groups to do what they do, but they're looking at us to be helping to create demand because, demand is a great way to bolster prices, and farmers would be happy if soybean prices were a little higher. So there was lots of talk with us about what new opportunities do we see? What markets do we see? And generally, we have a pretty good story to tell. We were able to talk about soybean exports are up this year versus last year, and we're attacking some of these new markets or making progress in some of these new markets. So that's all good. And then the tariff discussion came out kind of towards the tail end of the Commodity Classic. Those were announced. And I think that just makes people concerned. And yes, U.S. U.S. farmers in general supported this administration when they were elected. I think many surveys have shown that. And I think they're still giving the administration their support. I think they're saying, okay, these people know what they're doing, but we hope it works out. And we'd sure love some assurances that this is going to work out. So in summary, I think it's, the usual farmer optimism, but with some realism built in about the concerns they have in today's economics, and then counting on the administration to be doing the right thing so that in a few months' time, things are better than they are today.
Well said. Let's pan out for a moment. While we may be seized with some of the chaos that has ensued in recent weeks here in North America, what else, in your view, Jim, should we be thinking about when it comes to addressing some of the world's most pressing challenges? When we think about climate change, global food insecurity, and the role that the ag industry plays?
Yeah, that's a great question, Erin. And honestly, many of those things, I believe, are things that can make us optimistic, particularly about U.S. agriculture, and I think the same for Canadian agriculture. Many of those topics we have a solution for. We can help with. If it's global food insecurity, as we talked earlier, the U.S. and Canada produce a lot more than we're able to consume. So we are an exporter of nutrition to the world. So we need to have the opportunity to be able to do that. And that should give us demand for what we have. I have been, watching over the last couple of years since we've come out of COVID, and I see in many markets around the world, demand increasing for agricultural products. People are consuming more meat in countries where their economies are getting a little better, where the COVID kind of recovery continues. We see increased demand for increased demand because soybean meal and other products are so competitively priced. So our products are in strong demand. So we just need to be able to have the opportunity to supply them. And then on the whole subject of climate smart products and sustainability, and there are a lot of mixed topics about that today. In the United States, I think people are wondering, how should we be talking about this? I say, let's depoliticize this. Let's just kind of focus on the fact that people around the world, because I'm always kind of looking at it with my international angle, we know that people around the world who buy food products want to know that the food that they're buying, whether it's a piece of poultry meat in Thailand or an egg in Guatemala, or, you go to many countries around the world, they want to know, is this food that I'm buying, did it have any negative impact on the environment to produce it? And we can say from the United States, we can say no. And in fact, we've got a great track record of how our farmers have done nothing but continue to improve the way they treat their soil and the impact on the environment. We've got a very low carbon footprint. We've got great history in terms of what we're doing with soil erosion and many other factors that we measure. So this whole concern about climate smart agriculture, and again, I know that that's a term that turns some people off, but from a U.S. agricultural perspective, I look at that and I say, this is one of our strong points. It's a competitive advantage for U.S. agriculture, I suppose Canadian too, to be able to be out talking about that and highlighting how we are not causing a problem to the environment as we produce nutrition for people around the world. So I think when you put all that together, it's a really strong selling point for U.S. agriculture. And that's how I like to think about that. We need to communicate that and need to communicate it in a way that also doesn't turn our producers here in the United States off. Over the years that we've been talking about sustainability, I tell you, I have fielded a lot of pushback with people saying, sustainability, someone's going to tell me what to do. And I've said, wait a second. They're not asking you to do something you don't want to do. I don't know a single U.S. farmer that doesn't want to improve the quality of the soil on their farm and make sure they can pass their farm on to the next generation in better shape than it is today. That's what sustainability is really all about. There's three legs to the stool: environmental, which is what a lot of people talk about; social, which in the US and Canada is not really an issue. We have healthcare, we have schools, we have all of that. And then, of course, economic, because that's what our farmers are also worried about. And they need to have economic sustainability to be able to continue delivering this. So I think all those three things, I think if we can get people talking about them and really keep it in a calm and rational manner, I think it's a good thing for our North American agriculture to be talking about how we deliver that to the world.
I agree. I'm often surprised when folks, and in particular policymakers, because I know it's a different conversation with farmers, and we're having the same conversation with farmers in Canada as you are in the US. But I'm often struck by even those who are reluctant to talk about it or don't see value in having the conversation, whatever your belief may be, to your point, let's depoliticize it because there's an economic advantage. We have a competitive advantage, I think, in Canada and in the United States, perhaps by comparison to some other jurisdictions. And so let's leverage that competitive advantage. I think that's another way of looking at it.
That is, I fully agree with that, Erin. And I think it's our job as people who work in these trade associations representing our farmers. I think it's our job to kind of help connect those dots, because otherwise it can get misconstrued and can be seen as something else. But I think we need to connect those dots so they understand the advantage, thanks to their good work.
Excellent advice for many of our listeners who come from various associations. That's an important role for us to play. I understand that USEC is celebrating 20 years. You've been with the organization now for 14 years. As you reflect on your tenure with the organization, what are you most proud of?
Oh, well, that's a great question. And I'm always amazed when I hear 14 years. That's longer than it feels like. The number sounds bigger than it feels like.
Yeah.
So what am I proud of? USEC, the 20-year history we have is building on a much longer history when ASA International Marketing used to be doing international work, and our soy farmers, they opened their first office in Japan in 1956. So what is that, 68, 69 years ago? So there's been a long history of international work, and I already mentioned the importance of international markets to U.S. soy. So being able to continue that and being able to help lead and solidify the role of this organization that was created by ASA and USB, two other big farm organizations, to be solely focused on international markets. I think to assemble the team of people we have around the world is probably something that makes me really proud. At Commodity Classic, I had a lot of farmers say to me, "Wow, you've got great people working." They'd interacted with our people in one way or another. And they tell me what a great team we have. And it really makes me proud and makes me feel good for those people that they are recognized as being solid performers and leaders. And then the other thing I think is we were just talking about sustainability. And I think that's been such a misunderstood item. And 10 years ago, when we first were sort of being pushed with sustainability by European interests, and our first inclination was to push back and say, no, we're going to play defense and you don't know what you're talking about. And I think to be able to, through thinking about it and through studying the situation and gathering data, to be able to turn it around and have it be a competitive advantage. I think that's a place, because we're always trying to show the value of the products we represent. And so sustainability, along with the components of the soybean, are ways we try to show value. So I think those are the people and the way we have turned sustainability around into a competitive advantage, I guess, would be the key things that I'm proud of.
And I have the pleasure of serving with one of your people. Rosalind Leck and I are both on the executive committee with the International Grain Trade Coalition. So I've gotten to know Ros quite well over the years, and I've really enjoyed working with and learning from her.
And she has been actively involved in helping us work on our sustainability issues. And in particular, over the last year, I think maybe she spent 2 years of her life in the last year, and I'm being joking there, working on the EUDR issue, which is a whole nother issue. But I think there, again, if you take the time to understand it and think about what does the data tell us, maybe there's an advantage there that if it gets rolled out in the proper way, it can actually be an advantage rather than a detriment for us.
Great way of looking at it. Excellent. My final question for you now in closing, Jim, I appreciate this conversation. It's been a good one. I have a personal interest in leadership, having studied the topic as part of my graduate degree. And I think that increasingly many of the unprecedented challenges that we are facing require unprecedented leadership. So I want to close all of my conversations by asking my guests to weigh in on the topic. And my question for you is this. In your bio, you refer to yourself as a glass half full optimist. And I got to tell you, that's coming through today. But at a time when we are feeling, a little desperate and the sector is facing a number of pretty significant challenges, I want to know what gives you hope. Is there anything right now that leaves you with a sense of optimism when it comes to the sector's future? And if you could, please share that with us.
Oh, thank you very much for that question. And absolutely, I am optimistic about the future. And I sort of base that on the fact that, again, we've got roughly 3% of the world's population in the United States. So a lot more people living out of the United States. People are going to want to continue to eat, and they're going to want to continue to have better diets. And there's an awful lot of people in that world population that don't get to consume all the meat that they want to consume or use all the cooking oil they want to consume. So I think there's a great opportunity for demand to continue to grow. And our U.S. soy industry, I know, can do a great job delivering on that. So I think as long as we can have, a clear path to be able to achieve that, there's room for optimism. So my job, I see it, is trying to help put that together, trying to make sure when we hear about things like tariffs or when we hear about other things, that we just kind of slow down. Let's think about how do we deal with this and how can we turn a negative into a positive. That's, I don't always do a very good job of that. And that's not always the first reaction, but it's always the reaction I want to have. So I try to think about things rationally, slowly, and try to come up with a way. How do we turn a challenge into an opportunity? And I think as long as all of us who work in the field of agriculture, I'm sure you probably feel the same way, that there's lots of challenges and they can be really bad if we want to let them. But our job as leaders in these associations is to try and get past the really bad and turn it into somewhat of an opportunity. And of course, to fight off the really bad when there's just no other way. But generally, we can turn these things into an opportunity. So that's what I try to do.
What an excellent note on which to end this conversation and our series of 3 conversations that we've had in the last 2 weeks with our American colleagues. Thanks for this, Jim. I hope you found this episode as thought-provoking and inspiring as I did. Remember that these fireside chats with Erin are monthly, so mark your calendars. We will be back next month with another great conversation. Stay connected with us for more engaging conversations that delve into the heart of the grain industry. You can catch us on your favorite podcast platforms, including Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube. Just search for Fireside Chats with Erin and hit the subscribe button so that you never miss an episode. Until next time.